My name is Alice, and I am a housewife living an ordinary life. My husband, John, is very kind, and we've never even had an argument. I don't mean to boast, but he was the best partner I could ask for. Since both of my parents have passed away, we currently live in an apartment near John's parents' house. The reason is simple. We wanted to be close in case our child was born or if any problem arose. Also, considering that John's parents would eventually need care, I thought living here would be an advantage for both of us. So, I agreed. But every time we had dinner with John's parents, I started getting sick with unexplained stomach pains. For a while, I tried to avoid meals at John's house, but due to unavoidable circumstances, I had to go there. However, an unexpected event occurred, and everyone was shocked. Moreover, it became clear that my mother-in-law had been engaging in an unbelievable act behind our backs, which explained my previously unexplained stomach pain. Let me go back to the story before I started getting sick. We didn't have a wedding ceremony. I don't particularly enjoy being the center of attention, and we thought that it would be better to spend our money on travel and hobbies instead of a wedding ceremony. In light of our decision, my mother-in-law suggested that we at least have a dinner party. Apparently, she held free cooking classes as a hobby and was quite skilled at it. So, to celebrate our marriage, she wanted to showcase her culinary skills and was very excited about the idea. I had no particular reason to refuse, and I was delighted to receive such a proposal from my mother-in-law. So, I visited John's family home, but I somehow felt unwelcomed. Welcome. Although mother-in-law said that, she didn't smile. Of course, she warmly welcomed her son, John, but I felt a certain coldness towards me. Regardless of my confusion, the dinner party started, and a variety of extravagant dishes prepared by my mother-in-law were served. Some of the dishes were so exquisite that I forgot about my mother-in-law's cold attitude that I had sensed earlier. Seeing such hospitality, I expressed my gratitude to her for the delicious meals and dishes. And she responded with a delighted smile, telling me to eat as much as I liked. So, I thought that my feeling of not being welcomed might be a misunderstanding, and I had a pleasant time. However, that night, I was suddenly hit with severe stomach pain. I ran to the bathroom, and while holed up in there, my strength were drained, and I started to lose consciousness. Eventually, John, who was worried, took me to the emergency room. Since it was night, there was no specialist doctor, and although I couldn't get a detailed diagnosis, they concluded it wasn't food poisoning. Personally, I thought that the expired bread I had eaten in the morning might be the cause, but I never found out what caused it. After lying in bed and getting an IV for 2 hours, my condition stabilized. I went home with John and went to sleep. Ever since that incident, each time I had a meal at my in-laws, I suffered from an unexplainable stomach pain. When I consulted a friend whom I hadn't met for a long time over lunch about this problem, "Isn't it that just going to your husband's house itself is causing you stress?" she gave me this advice. She actually had gotten sick due to harassment from her mother-in-law, and after she bought a new apartment further away and moved there, her health improved. I didn't think that going to my in-laws was a source of stress, but after hearing my friend's advice, I thought that perhaps I was feeling that way somewhere in my heart. Plus, since I complained of getting sick every time I visited my in-laws, my husband, who initially didn't pay much mind to it, started to worry seriously. Therefore, at my husband's suggestion, we decided to stop visiting my in-laws for a while. The cause was unknown, but since I always got sick after eating at my in-laws, my husband began to suspect that it was his mother's cooking. According to my husband, my mother-in-law frequently sent messages saying, "I feel lonely without having meals together." But he turned her down because he was worried about me. However, this time, with a troubled expression, he said to me,
"My brother is going to my parents' place to greet them for his wedding, so I can't decline this time."
Apparently, a dinner meeting was planned at my in-laws with the entire family, and we were asked to participate. I somewhat wanted to avoid meeting my mother-in-law directly, but I couldn't neglect my brother-in-law and his wife just for that reason. So, I decided to participate. However, no one could have predicted that this dinner would cause such a huge commotion. Nonetheless, my husband, who was concerned about my health, told me,
I'll tell Mom, so you don't have to eat the meals, Alice.
And today is the day of that dinner meeting. The smile on my mother-in-law's face when she greeted us was as warm as ever towards my husband, but I felt her attitude towards me was even colder than before. When we were led into the room, my brother-in-law and his wife had already arrived and were having a pleasant conversation with my father-in-law. In the meantime, my mother-in-law's homemade dishes were lined up on the table one after another. As usual, they were visually appealing and the smell made me hungry. It was a mystery why I'd get sick while eating such delicious-looking meals, and no matter how many times I thought about it, I couldn't find a reason. As soon as I sat down, my mother-in-law immediately suggested that I start eating. But my husband swiftly came to my rescue, saying,
Alice is not feeling well today.
But to my mother-in-law, that seemed to be a minor issue that could be ignored. She handed me a dish served on a small plate and looked at me with a wordless smile. It felt as if she was saying, "You can eat this much, can't you?" And I didn't know how to respond. At that moment, my brother-in-law, who had heard my husband's words, spoke up in my defense.
Alice, we're grateful that you've come despite not feeling well. It's fine just to exchange greetings today, so if you feel sick, please don't hesitate to go home and rest.
It seems my husband had explained the situation to him in advance, and he and his wife understood and were on my side. When their two sons said that, my mother-in-law seemed to think it was wrong to push me to eat, so she said, "In that case, I'll put it in a Tupperware. Please, let me know what you think after you eat it." I wondered why my mother-in-law was so intent on getting me to eat her meals, but to avoid upsetting her, I nodded. Then, the moment she went to the kitchen to get the Tupperware, we heard a loud clatter. Everyone turned toward the sound and saw my father-in-law clutching his stomach in pain. He hadn't started eating yet, so it was completely unclear as to why he was suffering. In panic, my mother-in-law asked what had happened, while supporting her husband. Despite his pain, my father-in-law answered,
Ugh! My stomach hurts so much I can't bear it. I only nibbled a little of the food in the kitchen before everyone gathered.
With that, he collapsed weakly. "You must be joking! That was something I made to feed Alice. Wait, this is not the time to think about that. Call an ambulance." My mother-in-law panicked and immediately called an ambulance, then rushed to the hospital with my father-in-law in the ambulance. Meanwhile, we were all frozen, blankly staring for a while, but what my mother-in-law had said stuck in my mind. The fact that what my father-in-law had snacked on was actually something prepared for me. That implies there was something wrong with that food. Out of concern, I headed to the kitchen that my mother-in-law had always strictly kept me away from. There, I found something that left me in shock. Finally, I understood the cause of why I'd get sick and why my father-in-law had collapsed. It's so crazy to me that she'd do something like this. I let out a huge sigh. I needed to decide how to handle this. I couldn't forgive this. I had to get my revenge. We each drove to the hospital where my father-in-law was taken. After checking in at the reception, we immediately headed for the patient room. We could hear two voices from inside. Apart from my mother-in-law's voice, I thought the other was probably a male doctor. Apparently, my mother-in-law was being questioned by the doctor about what had happened. "I'm telling you, I don't know anything. He just suddenly collapsed while we were all enjoying the meals."
Is that true? Can you think of anything, like if he ate something rotten or expired?
I said I don't know anything. My mother-in-law kept avoiding the doctor's questions in that way. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door of the hospital room. When my mother-in-law noticed us in a flustered manner, she said, "Oh, Alice and John, you're here too. Your father is okay. Please go home and enjoy dinner with the four of you." I had a hunch about mother-in-law's somewhat flustered manner. As she tried to close the door, I grabbed it and said, "No, I'd like to talk to you a bit, mother-in-law," with a calm smile. Behind me, my husband was silently exerting his presence, and my brother-in-law and his wife were sending sharp, cold glances. Therefore, my mother-in-law couldn't refuse us there and said, "Okay," reluctantly letting us into the room. Father-in-law's facial color seemed to be returning a bit, looking more stable, but the exact cause was yet to be determined. Apparently, he was still conscious when he was brought to the hospital, and had been frequently using the bathroom. However, the doctor explained that he eventually completely lost consciousness due to dehydration. Then my mother-in-law forced a smile. "Well, your father's getting old, and he drinks beer every day." She spoke as if she was making an excuse. However, my mother-in-law, who understood that not only the doctor, but also we were not convinced by her excuse, could not say anything, immediately closed her mouth. I looked at my mother-in-law with a serious gaze, took the evidence out of my bag, and showed it to her. Seeing what had brought out, my mother-in-law widened her eyes, broke into a cold sweat, and was clearly confused. "Mother-in-law, isn't this a laxative? I found some powdered laxatives in the kitchen. What's this about?" I asked calmly, but my mother-in-law remained silent. At the sight of the laxatives, the doctor seemed to understand.
"Ah, that would make sense. If he had diarrhea without being food poisoned, generally intake of laxatives is a possibility," he explained.
As a result of subsequent detailed examinations, it became clear that my father-in-law had indeed ingested a large amount of laxatives. The final diagnosis was that the laxatives had made his intestines hyperactive, causing repeated abdominal pain and diarrhea, leading to dehydration. Driven into a situation where my mother-in-law could no longer make excuses, she said, "Wait! At first, I only expected Alice to get a little sick. But because Alice was fine, I gradually increased the amount of laxatives." And finally, she confessed. The motive for this series of actions was clear. She felt that I had taken away her beloved eldest son. From there, the small amount of laxatives she started to spitefully mix in gradually escalated, eventually increasing to an amount that would cause a person to collapse. I was simply unable to hide my surprise, but I told my mother-in-law, "What you've done is just crazy. You may not know this, but I've been to the hospital multiple times for IVs because of unexplained symptoms. Despite this, I can't understand why you would attempt to mix in such a huge amount of laxatives." My mother-in-law, having her mistake pointed out, found no room to argue and hung her head in frustration. And then there were a series of criticisms towards her from her sons.
"Mom, no matter the circumstances, this can't be forgiven. It just so happens that Alice didn't respond that sensitively to the laxatives. But what you've done is the same as a crime."
After my husband finished speaking, my brother-in-law was next.
"I thought it was unthinkable, but were you trying to do the same thing to my wife? Thinking about it that way, it's really scary."
And as he said that, he pulled his wife closer and threw a stern gaze at his mother. The doctor continued,
Medication should be used in the proper amounts and methods. As your son said, luckily your daughter-in-law's symptoms were mild. But your husband had no resistance to laxatives, and thus had this severe reaction.
Shut up! Because... Even though she was of age, my mother-in-law began to cry like a small child. Then a voice was heard from the direction of the bed.
How could you do such a terrible thing?
Looking towards the direction of the voice, there was my father-in-law, who had regained consciousness, speaking to us. Crying, my mother-in-law grasped my father-in-law's hand. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. But he forcefully shook off her hand. Shocked by the events of that moment, my mother-in-law was frozen in place. My father-in-law, watching this scene, let out a deep sigh, and then...
Even if you didn't intend to hurt me, it's a fact that you've caused Alice to suffer a lot. That's not right. It's a shameful act as a human being.
In response to my father-in-law's words, my mother-in-law begged for forgiveness, as if she were clinging to him. She further turned to me. I apologize for my actions up until now. I will never do such a thing again. Please, forgive me. If you forgive me, I'm sure my husband and the boys will be convinced too, right? Seeing such a scene, I thought it must be a performance, and she wasn't really feeling bad about me. So, I smirked. What are you talking about? I'm not even considering forgiving you now, after all I've been through. Following my words, my husband stood next to me and said,
Mother, stay away from Alice. I can no longer think of someone who hurt my beloved wife as family.
What? John, how can you say such a thing? Having been rejected as family by her beloved son, mother-in-law collapsed to her knees. Watching this scene, my brother-in-law nodded and said,
I can't imagine living with someone who could potentially harm my wife. I have no intention of you being my family anymore,
he declared strongly. Finally understanding that her selfish jealousy caused this situation, my mother-in-law continued to beg for forgiveness, broken down in tears. However, no one said a word, simply looking down at her. Thinking there was only one person left on her side, my mother-in-law, seemingly forgetting she had been rejected earlier, turned to my father-in-law, sobbing. What about you? You won't abandon me, your wife, will you? However, my father-in-law retorted,
What of it? I can't stay with someone who commits such inhumane acts anymore. I want a divorce.
My mother-in-law was crushed by his words.
Let's go home soon. Dad, you should rest a little more too.
Everyone agreed to my husband's suggestion, and we said goodbye to my father-in-law and left the hospital room. As we were waiting for my husband to retrieve the car and come to the entrance, suddenly my mother-in-law ran towards us, panting. Alice, please, forgive me. See, I'm begging you. While looking at my mother-in-law's face, covered in tears and snot, I said, I have no reason to risk my life to be with you, mother-in-law. If I forgive you now, I don't think it will truly be for your benefit. I replied coldly. Just as I finished speaking, my husband arrived in the car. We got in, and towards Alice, through the window, I said, This is goodbye. We will likely never meet again. Take care. At my cold words, my mother-in-law said nothing and watched us leave, murmuring something as if in prayer, looking up at the sky. Later, as my father-in-law had declared, he divorced and indeed moved out. My husband and brother-in-law cut off their relationships with their mother. Previously, my father-in-law was the leaseholder and paid the rent for the apartment, but since he left after the divorce, Alice had to start paying the rent herself. However, mother-in-law had been a housewife all her life and didn't know how to earn a living. She tried to make ends meet with a portion of the money she received from the property division in the divorce, but that money quickly ran out. She tried to charge for her cooking classes, which she was good at, and reached out to various people, but as news of the incident spread, she was left with no students. As a result, she couldn't pay the rent, was evicted from her home, and only then did she realize the harshness of reality. My mother-in-law started looking for work. Without a place to live, it was difficult, and she is now homeless. This is what people call karma. And then I was released from my unexplained illness, and right after that, it was found out that I was pregnant. My husband and my father-in-law have been in contact after the divorce, and when he heard about my pregnancy, he was even happier than we were. My father-in-law is overjoyed at the prospect of his first grandchild, and he has already prepared a stroller and car seat for us, which is truly a blessing. I never imagined that my father-in-law would be such a doting grandfather. Although I thought he was always a silent person, I was able to discover a playful new side to him, and I am filled with joy as a family member. What's more, my brother-in-law and his wife had twins. Our family grew all at once, making our lives even more lively, and I am really looking forward to our new life with our new family members and the fresh days to come.